When we imagine medieval feasts, we think of long wooden tables, overflowing goblets of wine, roasted meats, and sweet pastries. But behind this image of abundance lurked a hidden danger. In the Middle Ages, food could kill you faster than a knight's sword. Dishes that seemed harmless were laced with toxins, poor preservation turned meals into poison, and certain delicacies were as lethal as they were luxurious. To eat was not just to survive, it was to gamble with your life. From deadly bread to poisonous meats and even fruits that carried hidden death, medieval dining halls were silent killers disguised as celebrations. Tonight, you will see how a simple meal could end a dynasty. This is the horrific story of food death. The medieval banquet hall is one of the most enduring images of history. Flickering torchlight illuminated vaulted ceilings. Long tables were lined with nobles, courtiers, and clergy, and the sound of lutes and laughter filled the air. Platters of roasted boar, trenchers of bread, goblets of red wine, and pies spiced with cinnamon and cloves painted a picture of abundance. But beneath this grand display of wealth and festivity lay a truth no minstrel dared to sing. Medieval food was not only a luxury, it was a gamble with death. To sit at a feast was to risk your life, for every dish might conceal a hidden killer. Why was food so dangerous? Part of the answer lies in preservation. Today we live in a world of refrigeration, sterilization, and regulations. But in the Middle Ages, food was left to the mercy of time, weather, and superstition. Meat hung in smoky kitchens, sometimes for weeks, until its smell could no longer be masked by heavy layers of salt or pungent spices. Milk soured within hours and was often transformed into cheese in an attempt to extend its lifespan. But even that process could easily turn rotten. Bread, the very foundation of the medieval diet, might look wholesome, but in poor harvest years it could hide toxic fungi that attacked the nervous system and caused madness, seizures, and even death. And yet, people had no way of knowing. Science had not yet entered the dining hall. What one man called a curse from God, or a punishment for sin, was often the result of food poisoning, ergot contamination, or botulism. Death after a feast was often blamed on witches, demons, or divine wrath, when in reality, the culprit sat directly on the plate. In this way, medieval diets blurred the line between nourishment and poison, between blessing and curse. Another factor was excess. Feasts were not modest affairs. They were spectacles meant to display wealth and power. Nobles competed with one another for the most exotic and impressive dishes. Swans roasted with their feathers reattached, pies filled with live birds that flew out when cut, porpoise stews, and even gilded pastries dusted with real gold. All of these dazzled the eye. But the more exotic the dish, the greater the risk. Imported spices from the East were often adulterated with toxic powders to stretch their value. Meats that had traveled days without proper preservation became breeding grounds for lethal bacteria. Even the obsession with color green sauces, red jellies, golden custards was achieved with dyes made from toxic minerals like lead or arsenic. To impress was to endanger. But the threat of food went beyond the accidental. Poisoning was a weapon in the arsenals of kings and rivals. A cup of wine laced with deadly herbs could change the course of dynasties. Bitter almonds, belladonna, hemlock, and arsenic could be slipped into a dish undetected. Courts were obsessed with the possibility of assassination by food, and tasters were often employed to sample meals before they reached royal lips. Yet even the tasters were not always safe. Some poisons acted slowly, creeping into the body over hours or even days, giving the illusion of natural sickness. In this atmosphere of paranoia, food became a tool of politics, a weapon as deadly as any blade. For the poor, the danger was different, but no less lethal. While nobles risked excess and exotic poisons, peasants lived close to famine. In years of scarcity, desperation drove families to consume whatever they could find. Bread made from spoiled rye, mushrooms gathered without knowledge, meat scavenged from diseased animals. These were not luxuries, but survival choices. Yet each bite could bring disease, madness, or a slow-wasting death. For the poor, food was not a banquet but a cruel trickster. One day, it gave life. The next, it took it away. Religion also shaped the medieval relationship with food. The church dictated what could and could not be eaten, enforcing strict fasting rules. Fish became a staple on holy days, but improper preservation of salted or dried fish often led to outbreaks of deadly foodborne illness. Ironically, in seeking holiness, many starved monks and pious villagers consumed meals that poisoned them in the name of faith. In monasteries, records tell of entire groups of brothers falling ill after eating rancid fish or improperly stored grains. To them, it was a spiritual test. To us, it is a testament to the fragility of medieval life. The psychology of food fear was powerful. People lived in an age when invisible forces, demons, curses, or spirits were blamed for sickness. They could not see bacteria or toxins, but they saw the results: convulsions, hallucinations, madness, sudden death. Tales spread of cursed villages where bread drove people insane, or of banquets where lords fell dead after the first toast. In such a world, to eat was never simple. It was to place trust in the cook, the baker, the brewer, the fisherman, the farmer, and behind them, in God himself. Every bite carried both hope and dread. This is why medieval food is more than just an odd curiosity of history. It reveals a world where survival was uncertain, where life and death balanced on the edge of a blade or on the edge of a knife cutting bread. For the nobility, for the peasantry, for the monks and knights, food was not merely sustenance, it was fate, disguised in the humble form of a meal. And so, in the centuries that followed, stories survived of meals that killed instantly, of foods that masqueraded as delicacies but carried death within. These are not just myths, they are warnings carved into the memory of Europe. The 5 foods we are about to uncover were more than dangerous. They were assassins hiding in plain sight, killers placed on the table by custom, greed, and ignorance. And when you hear them, you will never look at medieval banquets the same way again. The medieval world was filled with strange delicacies, but behind the grandeur of royal banquets and the desperation of peasant kitchens lurked foods so lethal they could end life in an instant. These weren't just rare accidents, they were part of everyday diets. What follows are 5 of the most notorious killers to ever sit on a medieval table. 1. Rye bread and the curse of ergot. For the poor, bread was life itself. Yet in years of damp harvests, the rye crops were infected by a fungus called ergot, a silent parasite that transformed bread into poison. To the medieval mind, ergot poisoning looked like sorcery. Villagers would eat bread one day, and the next, entire households would writhe in agony. Limbs burned with fiery pain, fingers blackened and fell off, and the unlucky collapsed into seizures, hallucinations, and madness. Known later as St. Anthony's Fire, this disease spread terror across Europe. Some victims claimed to see visions of demons or heavenly angels. Others raved like the possessed, their screams echoing in the streets. Many never recovered, their bodies wasted away as the fungus destroyed blood vessels. In reality, ergot contains chemicals similar to LSD. A contaminated loaf could send entire villages into hysteria. Whole communities were once blamed for witchcraft or demonic possession when, in truth, the culprit was a humble rye field infected with spores. Bread was supposed to be the staff of life. But in medieval Europe, one unlucky harvest could transform it into an executioner that worked slowly, painfully, and cruelly. 2. Poisoned mead and ale. The silent tavern killers. Drinking was safer than water in the Middle Ages, at least in theory. Rivers and wells were filled with filth, so people drank beer, ale, and mead daily. But these brews carried hidden dangers of their own. Fermentation in filthy casks often produced deadly toxins. Medieval brewers, lacking hygiene or chemical knowledge, could easily create a drink laced with bacteria strong enough to rot intestines. Worse still, unscrupulous tavern owners sometimes cut their drinks with poisons to increase profit. Lead was mixed into cider to sweeten it. copper salts were used to brighten beer's froth, and poisonous herbs like henbane or hemlock were added to make the brew stronger. The results were terrifying. A single cup could bring violent vomiting, delirium, paralysis, or even death. For peasants and laborers who depended on ale for daily hydration, this was no minor risk. It was a constant shadow over their lives. In monasteries and towns, mass poisonings occurred after entire barrels turned rancid, yet few suspected the drink itself. Instead, it was often blamed on bad air, curses, or the will of God. The tavern, a place of fellowship and cheer, could just as easily become a trap where one unlucky sip meant your last. 3. Eel, fish, and the perils of fasting. The church ruled medieval diets, and fasting was a sacred obligation. On holy days and during Lent, Christians were forbidden to eat meat, so fish became the main substitute. Markets overflowed with salted herring, dried cod, and barrels of eels. But beneath this religious devotion lurked danger. Fish spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration, barrels of salted fish often went rancid within days. If consumed, they carried diseases like botulism, a paralysis that shut down the muscles, leaving victims gasping for breath until death suffocated them. Eels were especially risky. They lived in muddy rivers and absorbed toxins, yet were considered a delicacy, often eaten by nobles in massive feasts. Improperly prepared eel dishes sometimes killed entire households. Even kings were not safe. Records tell of nobles collapsing after fast day meals that had turned foul in storage. Ironically, in their attempt to obey God's laws, many medieval Christians poisoned themselves. The very food meant to purify their souls ended up corrupting their bodies, leaving them writhing in pain on the cold floors of monasteries or villages. 4. Deadly cheeses and milk gone wrong. Milk was fragile in the medieval world. Without refrigeration, it spoiled within hours. Cheese and butter were methods of preservation, but even these could turn lethal. Rancid cheese was infamous for causing stomach convulsions, vomiting, and diarrhea so violent it killed within days. Some cheeses harbored listeria, a bacteria still dangerous today, but in medieval times it went unchecked. Infants and pregnant women were the most vulnerable. Chroniclers recorded cases where entire families wasted away after eating tainted curds. But even more sinister was intentional poisoning. Monks, apothecaries, and cooks knew how easily herbs or minerals could be hidden in cheese. Arsenic could be mixed into curds without altering flavor, and belladonna could be baked into buttered pastries. Such methods became popular tools of assassination. A single bite of poisoned cheese could quietly end the life of a rival before anyone suspected foul play. What looked like an innocent dairy dish was, in truth, a convenient murder weapon, soft, creamy, and fatally effective. 5. Deadly feasts. Lead, gold, and poisoned luxury. If peasants feared spoiled bread and rotten fish, nobles faced a different danger: luxury itself. The obsession with extravagance led to dishes laced with materials no human should ever consume. Food was often dyed with minerals red with cinnabar, a mercury compound, green with copper, or white with lead. Nobles consumed these pigments daily, unaware that they slowly poisoned their organs. Over time, many grew weak, paranoid, or infertile, their bodies deteriorating from within. Even more dangerous was the fashion of eating from pewter plates or drinking wine stored in lead-lined vessels. Sweet wines became even sweeter when infused with lead salts, a practice so common it's believed to have crippled Roman aristocrats centuries earlier. In medieval courts, the same mistake was repeated. Dinner tables glittered with wealth, but the glitter masked death. And then came the ultimate absurdity dishes decorated with gold leaf. It symbolized wealth and purity, yet consumed in large amounts, it sickened the body. To eat gold was to declare oneself above common men, but it was also to invite ruin. The very extravagance meant to immortalize nobles instead helped to destroy them. The silent grim reaper of the table. From peasant huts to royal halls, Food in the Middle Ages was never truly safe. Whether it was ergot in the fields, toxins in the brewery, spoiled fish from monasteries, or poisoned delicacies at court, every meal carried the risk of instant death. To sit down to dinner was not just to eat, it was to gamble with fate. A loaf of bread could lift hunger, or it could summon madness. A goblet of ale could quench thirst, or it could burn your veins. And in the dim light of a medieval hall, no one knew which outcome awaited them. This was the dark reality of food in the Middle Ages. The table was not just a place of nourishment. It was a stage where death often played its role. For medieval men and women, food was more than sustenance. It was a force that could bless or betray, a daily ritual wrapped in faith, fear, and fate. To modernize, eating might seem a simple act, but in the Middle Ages, every loaf, every cup, every bite carried the possibility of death. That reality did not simply shape diets. It shaped cultures, beliefs, and even the course of history. Food and superstition. When meals became curses. When a villager fell ill after eating bread, few suspected ergot fungus. Instead, whispers of witchcraft or divine punishment spread like wildfire. A sickened household might accuse neighbors of hexing their oven, or believe demons had entered their bread. In France and Germany, entire witch hunts erupted after outbreaks of ergot poisoning, with women burned alive because their neighbors had suffered fits after a meal. Similarly, when ale turned rancid, people believed evil spirits had crept into the barrel at night. Taverns were said to be haunted by beer demons, and charms were nailed to casks to ward them off. A spoiled drink wasn't just a matter of bad brewing, it was evidence of the supernatural at work. Even nobles were not spared from paranoia. If a lord grew sick after a feast, suspicion immediately fell on the cook or cupbearer. Tales of poisoned cheese or tainted wine often ended in executions. Servants who had prepared meals were dragged before courts, tortured, and sometimes killed not because they were guilty, but because someone powerful needed an explanation for a noble's suffering. Thus, food became inseparable from fear. A poisoned plate was not merely an accident. It was a curse, a plot, or a divine punishment. The rise of food tasters and poison masters. Out of this paranoia emerged a strange new role in noble courts. The food taster. Before a king or duke lifted a fork, a servant would sample the dish. If the taster lived, the lord ate. If the taster convulsed, the food was abandoned. This practice became standard in many royal households, though it did little to protect against slow poisons like lead or mercury, which killed over weeks rather than minutes. Meanwhile, in the shadows, poisoners became infamous figures. In Italy, families like the Borgias allegedly perfected the art of mixing lethal substances into meals, using arsenic or powdered gems to kill political rivals. Rumors claim they even hid poisons inside rings, dripping toxins into cups with a single gesture. The line between cook and assassin grew dangerously thin. A banquet was both a celebration and a battlefield, where invisible weapons might be served on golden plates. The peasants' struggle. Hunger versus death. For peasants, the story was even grimmer. They had no tasters, no gilded plates, no way to test their food. Bread made from infected rye was often the only thing standing between their children and starvation. Even if it looked strange or tasted bitter, hunger forced them to eat. And when the inevitable sickness came, few could afford a doctor. They turned instead to village healers who prescribed charms, prayers, or bizarre remedies. Some wore amulets against fire in the blood. Others believed boiling herbs in milk could drive away the devil inside spoiled fish. Tragically, these cures rarely worked. Entire families vanished in waves of famine and food poisoning, their absence marked only by a priest's record in the parish book. To eat was to survive, but to eat was also to risk everything: food, faith, and death on the holy days. Religion made the danger even sharper. On fast days, fish was the only legal meal, and to refuse it was to risk the church's wrath. Yet every monk and nun who sat at the monastery table knew the barrel of salted herring could turn deadly. Many saw death from spoiled fish not as an accident, but as a test of faith. Chroniclers wrote that those who died after a fast day meal had been judged by God, purified by suffering, or punished for secret sins. Thus, poison became theology, and rot became divine will. In some cases, martyrs were even created out of food deaths. A monk who collapsed after eating rancid eel might later be remembered as a saint who endured holy torment rather than as a victim of poor storage. This blending of faith and food created a society where death at the table was not only accepted, but sometimes revered. Medicine and the early science of poison. Despite superstition, medieval physicians began noticing patterns. They observed that certain cheeses or wines made many people ill, while fresh bread rarely did. Without modern science, their theories were crude, but they laid the foundation for toxicology. In apothecaries' books, one can find lists of foods that kill swiftly and foods that poison the stomach. Remedies included charcoal, vinegar, or powdered pearls. While these cures were mostly ineffective, they showed a growing awareness that food itself could harbor hidden dangers. By the late Middle Ages, kings and nobles began funding alchemists to study poisons not to cure them, but to wield them as weapons. Poison knowledge became power, and food became a battlefield of politics as much as nutrition. Legacy: the echoes of deadly meals. The legacy of these deadly foods still lingers. Ergot outbreaks continued into the 19th century, shaping events as large as witch trials and famines. The paranoia over poisoned banquets inspired entire traditions of court etiquette, from silver goblets, believed to detect toxins, to ritual prayers before meals. Even today, echoes remain. The phrase "breaking bread" once meant unity, but in medieval Europe, it also carried the unspoken risk of sharing poison. Our modern obsession with food safety expiration dates, kitchen hygiene, laboratory testing was born out of centuries of death at the table. And perhaps the most haunting lesson is this: the medieval world did not see food as innocent. It was alive with danger, with curses, with hidden powers that could kill or bless. To sit at the table was to enter into a pact with fate. Closing reflection. The Middle Ages are often remembered for knights, castles, and plagues, but hidden beneath those grand stories lies a quieter, deadlier truth. Each meal was a gamble, each feast was a battlefield. Each loaf of bread, each goblet of ale, each bite of cheese could be salvation or a death sentence. It wasn't only swords, wars, or diseases that claimed lives in the medieval world. Often, it was the very thing meant to sustain them. This is the forbidden truth of medieval dining. Food was both life and executioner. If this dive into the deadly dining tables of the Middle Ages left you shaken, imagine what other dark truths history still hides. From poison-laced banquets to cursed bread that sparked witch trials, the past was far more terrifying than the fairy tales ever admit. Subscribe now for more forgotten stories where kings, peasants, and even children discovered that death often sat right beside them at the table. Because history isn't just about battles and crowns sometimes, it's about the food that killed,